In 1893, a governess was hired to care for a child in a quiet countryside home. She wrote about him every night. The problem was, no one else ever saw him. Not the staff, not the parents, not the neighbors, only her. And what she described was not a mischievous little boy hiding behind curtains. It was a child who behaved like someone trying very hard to imitate what a child should be. Like something wearing the idea of childhood, the way a person wears a borrowed coat. And the strangest part is this: her journal survived, the house survived, the nursery survived, but the child she wrote about, he never existed in any record. No birth certificate, no family portrait, no mention in letters. Nothing. Just her ink, just her trembling, careful handwriting, and one final entry that ends mid-sentence. Her name was Eleanor Hartwell, 26 years old, educated, proper, recommended by a reputable agency in London. A woman whose life had been defined by rules, posture, diction, silence. The position came through an advertisement, simple, refined, and oddly vague. A governess is required for a private situation. One child, excellent pay, absolute discretion expected. Excellent pay should have been her first warning, because in those days, people did not pay extra for manners. They paid extra for secrets. Eleanor arrived by train, then carriage, then quiet. A long gravel drive that swallowed sound, trees that leaned too close like they were listening. And at the end of it all, an old estate with tall windows and curtains drawn like eyelids. The kind of house that looked awake even when it wasn't. The kind of house that had survived too many winters and remembered every one of them. She was met at the door by a housekeeper named Mrs. Pruitt, gray-haired, stern, polite in the way a locked door is polite. Mrs. Pruitt took her coat, took her bag, and then said something that made Eleanor pause, not because it was rude, but because it sounded rehearsed. She said, "The child is upstairs." Then she added, after a beat, "You are to speak of him only when necessary." Eleanor smiled the way a governess smiles and said, "Of course." But inside, she felt the faint itch of confusion, because when people have children, they speak of them constantly.
She met the parents that evening. Mr. Ashford, a tall man with a soft voice and tired eyes. Mrs. Ashford, beautiful, composed, distant in a way that wasn't cold, just elsewhere. They welcomed Eleanor properly. Tea, a meal, questions about her schooling. They were polite, but there was something missing from the room, a space where a child's presence should have been. No toys by the fireplace, no scuffed floors from running feet, no interruptions, not even a laugh that someone tried to hush. Eleanor waited for them to ask the obvious, "How soon can you begin with him?" But they didn't. Instead, Mr. Ashford said, "You will find everything prepared." Mrs. Ashford added, "He is sensitive." Eleanor nodded. "In what way, madam?" A pause, a long one. Then Mrs. Ashford said lightly, as if discussing the weather, "He prefers quiet." And then, almost too quickly, Mrs. Pruitt cleared the dishes with a sharp clink of porcelain, like she wanted the conversation finished. Eleanor was shown to her room. As Mrs. Pruitt handed her the candle, she said one more thing. Her voice was low, respectful, but her eyes were serious. "Do not open the nursery window." Eleanor blinked. "Why not?" Mrs. Pruitt didn't answer. She only repeated it. "Do not open the nursery window." Then she left, and Eleanor sat alone, candlelight flickering, listening to the house settle and feeling for the first time that she had stepped into a place where rules were not meant to protect children. They were meant to protect everyone else. The next morning, Eleanor climbed the stairs with a book tucked under her arm. The hallway upstairs was colder, the carpet muffled her steps, and the air held that faint smell of old wood and something like dried flowers. She reached the nursery door. It was painted a pale color, once cheerful, now faded like a memory. She knocked. No answer. She opened it anyway. At first, she saw nothing. Sunlight leaked through heavy curtains. Dust drifted in thin columns. Then, from the far side of the room, a voice, small, soft, not frightened, not cheerful, just present. "Good morning." Eleanor turned. A boy stood near the toy chest, about 7 perhaps, dark hair combed neatly, clothes too formal for play. His face was pale and smooth, his expression careful as if he had practiced it. He didn't smile, he didn't frown. He watched her the way a portrait watches you. Eleanor's instincts kicked in. She softened her tone. "Good morning, I'm Miss Hartwell. I'll be your governess." The boy nodded once, not like a child nodding, like an adult agreeing to terms. "My name is Thomas," he said. His voice was odd, not in accent, not in pitch, in rhythm. It sounded like someone repeating speech they'd overheard. Eleanor stepped further into the room. The boy did not move. She glanced around for toys, books, evidence of life. There were toys, but they were arranged perfectly. A wooden horse lined up with soldiers, blocks stacked as if for display. Even the doll's tea set sat untouched, cups aligned. Nothing looked used, everything looked placed. Eleanor smiled gently. "Well, Thomas, shall we begin with reading?" Thomas said yes, then added, after a pause too long to be natural, "I enjoy reading." Eleanor sat at the small table, motioning him to join her. Thomas sat opposite. His hands rested flat on the table, still, too still. She opened the book. She began, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed normal, until Eleanor asked a simple question. "What is your favorite story?" Thomas looked at her. He blinked once, then said, "The one you are reading." Eleanor laughed quietly. "You haven't heard it yet." Thomas didn't laugh with her. He simply said, "I will like it." And in that moment, Eleanor felt it, a tiny cold prickle. Not fear, not yet, something else, the sensation of speaking to someone who was pretending. Days passed. Lessons in the morning, riding after lunch, quiet walks in the garden when the weather allowed. Thomas never ran ahead, never picked flowers, never chased anything. He walked beside Eleanor like a shadow made solid. But there was something stranger than his behavior. No one acknowledged him. Not once. Eleanor noticed it first with Mrs. Pruitt. They entered the dining room together. Thomas sat in his chair. Eleanor began to speak, politely. "Mrs. Pruitt, Thomas has been progressing well." Mrs. Pruitt didn't look at the boy, didn't glance toward his chair. She met Eleanor's eyes and said, "I'm glad you are comfortable, Miss Hartwell." Then she walked away, as if Eleanor had spoken to herself. Eleanor tried again later with Mr. Ashford. After lessons, she found him in the study. Thomas stood at the doorway, waiting. Eleanor said, "Sir, your son has a remarkable ear for language." Mr. Ashford's hand paused over his papers. He looked up, not at Thomas, at Eleanor, and he said calmly, "That is good." Then he lowered his eyes again, dismissed. No smile, no warmth, not even curiosity. Eleanor returned upstairs with Thomas trailing behind her, and when she looked down at him, she saw something in his face. Not sadness, not anger, just that same careful expression, like he expected this, like it was the rule. That night, Eleanor wrote in her journal,
The child is treated as though invisible. Either the household is unwell, or I am. A week into her position, Eleanor noticed something. Thomas never went near the nursery window, not once. Even when sunlight made the room warm and inviting, even when rain tapped lightly against the glass, he avoided it as if the air near it was sharp. One afternoon, Eleanor caught Thomas staring at the window from across the room. His eyes were fixed, his mouth slightly open. He looked distracted. Eleanor followed his gaze. The curtains were drawn, the window was shut, just as Mrs. Pruitt had instructed. Eleanor asked gently, "Thomas, why do you watch the window?" Thomas blinked. Then, very softly, he said, "Because something watches back." Eleanor's throat tightened. She tried to keep her voice calm. "What watches back?" Thomas's eyes shifted toward her, and for the first time, his expression cracked. Only for a second, a flicker of something beneath the practiced calm. He said, "If you open it, it will remember you." Eleanor felt a cold wave spread across her shoulders. She stood and walked toward the window, not because she wanted to, but because human beings have a terrible instinct to prove fear wrong. Thomas did not stop her. He only whispered, "Please don't." Her hand reached for the curtain, and then she heard it, not outside, inside. A soft scrape, like a fingernail dragged gently across wood, from behind the wall, from inside the room. Eleanor froze. The sound stopped. Thomas spoke again, almost kindly. "It doesn't like curtains." Eleanor stepped away from the window. Her skin prickled with gooseflesh. She turned to Thomas and asked the most important question of all. "Thomas, where are your parents?" Thomas stared at her and said, "They are not my parents."
That night, Eleanor's journal entries changed. Her handwriting became tighter. The ink pressed harder into the page. She wrote, "The child speaks as if he is repeating something learned. Not a liar, something worse, something rehearsed." She wrote, "The household pretends the child does not exist. I cannot decide if it is cruelty or fear." And then, 3 nights later, she wrote this, "Thomas asked me today if I remembered him. I told him I had only just met him. He said, 'No, before.' When I asked what he meant, he smiled. It was the first time I had ever seen him smile, and it did not belong on his face." Eleanor began to hear things at night. Soft footsteps in the upstairs hall, a child's voice murmuring words that didn't form sentences, and always, always, the faint scrape near the nursery wall, like something turning slowly, finding its way. On the 15th day of her employment, Eleanor woke before sunrise. She couldn't explain why. The house was too quiet. She dressed and walked upstairs. Her candle lit the hallway in trembling light. She reached the nursery door. It was open. That was wrong. Eleanor stepped inside. The room was colder than it had ever been. The toys were not arranged. They were scattered, as if someone had searched through them, as if someone had been looking for something they could not find. Eleanor whispered, "Thomas?" Silence. She looked toward the small table. A sheet of paper sat there, her writing paper, her pen. And on the paper, in careful handwriting that looked like hers but wasn't, were the words, "Do you remember me now?" Eleanor's breath caught. She backed up, and her heel struck something. A toy. The wooden horse. She looked down, and on its underside, scratched into the wood, was a name. Not Thomas, not Ashford. Another name, an older name,
a name that had been carved with pressure like a desperate act. Elias. Eleanor's candle trembled. Her mind raced. She turned toward the nursery window. The curtains stirred, though there was no breeze. And then, a small voice spoke from behind her. Not Thomas's voice, not that rehearsed, borrowed rhythm. Something older, something heavy, something that sounded like a child trying to speak through water. It said, "You opened it." Eleanor spun around. No one was there, but the candle flame bent sideways as if something had passed between it and the air. Eleanor ran, down the stairs, down the hall, into the parlor, where Mrs. Ashford was sitting, already awake, sipping tea as if nothing in the world could ever surprise her again. Eleanor gasped, "Where is he?" Mrs. Ashford didn't look confused, didn't ask who. She simply set down her cup and said quietly, "You saw him." Eleanor's voice shook. "Of course I saw him. Your child." Mrs. Ashford's eyes lifted, tired, sad, not cruel, and she said, "We have no child." The words hit the room like cold iron. Eleanor stammered, "That's not possible. He's been with me every day. He spoke." Mrs. Ashford said, "Did he ever speak to anyone else?" Eleanor froze. Mrs. Ashford continued, "Did he ever leave the nursery with you and walk into the world like a real boy?" Eleanor's stomach turned because she realized something. Every time they walked the halls, the staff stepped aside without looking. Every time they entered a room, people spoke only to Eleanor, not because they were ignoring their son, because there was no son to acknowledge. Mr. Ashford entered then, pale and exhausted. He said one sentence, the only sentence he had likely said about this in years. "He returns when someone new arrives." Eleanor whispered, "Who is he?" Mrs. Ashford looked toward the ceiling, toward the nursery, and said, "A memory that refuses to die." Eleanor left the house that same day. At least, that is what the official record says. A carriage was ordered, her trunk was brought down, and Mrs. Pruitt stood by the door, hands folded, expression like stone. But Eleanor's journal suggests something else, because her final entry was written that night, not in her room, not in London, in the nursery. The entry reads, "I tried to leave. The moment I stepped into the hall, I heard him behind me, not walking, not running, just there. He said, 'Don't go.' I told him he wasn't real, and he said, 'Then why can you hear me breathing? I can feel the air changing, the candle won't stay steady, the window.' And that's where it ends. A single line drawn across the page, like her hand slipped. No signature, no closing, no good night, just a sentence that stops as if something stopped it. The journal was found months later in a locked drawer. Eleanor Hartwell was never seen again, and no obituary was ever printed. No missing person notice, no scandal, nothing. As if she too had become something the house chose not to acknowledge. Years later, when the Ashford estate was sold, workers were hired to renovate the upper floor. They found the nursery door sealed, boards over the frame, nails black with age, and a warning written in charcoal on the wall beside it. Not the Ashford's handwriting, not Mrs. Pruitt's. A delicate, educated script. A governess's script. It read, "Do not open. He learns your name." And according to the foreman's report, they obeyed. Because as they stood there in the silent upper hall, they could hear a child on the other side of the door, not crying, not laughing, just humming, like he was waiting for someone to remember him. And if you're wondering what became of that journal, it didn't end up in a museum, it didn't end up in a library, it vanished into private hands, passed quietly from collector to collector, and every so often, someone claims they've seen an extra line appear on the final page, a line that wasn't there before, written in the same careful hand. 3 simple words: I remember you.